studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
Walter Isaacson is here. He is the president and the CEO of the Aspen Institute. He has been chairman of CNN and managing editor of Time magazine. He's also the author of an acclaimed biography on Henry Kissinger. The new biography is Benjamin Franklin, American Life. It will hit bookstores on July 4th. Excerpt from the book are featured in a special issue of Time magazine, which is on the newsstands this week. Look at this cover, The Amazing Adventures of Ben Franklin, plus his 7 Great Virtues by Walter Isaacson. Let me just start at the beginning. What brought you, as busy as you are, with the books that you had written, to Benjamin Franklin?
Well, I was doing the Henry Kissinger biography, and I became fascinated with the notion of idealism in American diplomacy, and that mix of realism, which Ben Franklin did this great balance of power diplomacy during the Revolution between France, Netherlands, and Spain to get France in on our side. But he was also somebody who pushed America's ideals, and that made France want to come in on our side. And so I couldn't find a whole lot about Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy, so I was studying that. And then the more I studied him, he was like a media mogul. I mean, he had a great printing empire, a newspaper empire. He developed the American Postal Service in order to have a distribution system. And everything about him, he was the last great Renaissance person who did everything. And so I just became obsessed.
And did you also, knowing what your curiosity was, see things that this was a life worth examining because his passions were your passions?
Yeah.
Journalism, writing, foreign policy, America's values, on and on.
Yeah, I did share a lot of the things. I spent a lot of time as a journalist, a lot of time as a publisher, and then was very interested in diplomacy. But there was also something about Franklin, for good and for bad, that sort of strivingly upward mobile, yuppie entrepreneur, a man of the information age back then. And I could relate to that, not that I'll ever be as great as Franklin, I could relate to that, even the downside of that sort of really ambitious personality.
You said he was one of the great networkers of all time.
Yes, right.
I mean, he knew everybody in the Enlightenment.
He's like Europe. Me and you, Charlie.
Yeah, he knew everybody in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
In Europe. He was well known in Europe. He spent, 10, 12 years in Britain.
He was the most famous American of his time in Europe, by far.
Scientist.
Yeah.
Inventor.
We had conquered electricity and done the lightning rod, which made him world famous, because that was the biggest discovery in that century all over the world.
He always thought of himself as what?
A printer, a publisher. He thought of himself as a media person. What happened at age about 12, he decides he wants to be a writer. He's an apprentice to his older brother, who's not very nice to him. Right. And what he does is he takes a Spectator magazine, Addison and Steele's publication from London, and he reads the essays, and he copies the arguments, and then he cuts them up and shuffles them up and scatters them about and goes back to him a day later and tries to recreate the original essay to see if he could do it as well. And sometimes he would even turn it into poetry, so it would make him use different words and then turn it back into the essay, because he wanted to make himself, as he said, a tolerable writer. And that's how he first got into writing.
But then he liked books.
He loved books. He used to, he was so lucky that his dad apprenticed him to a print shop, because his father was going to send him to Harvard, but then decided he was not quite religious enough to go to Harvard to study for the...
He was too much of a free spirit,
Too much of a free spirit, exactly. In fact, at one point, his father was putting away all the stores for the winter. They were salting all the pork and the beef. And Franklin says, why don't we just say grace over it just once, and it'll last the entire winter? And that's when his father decided it would be silly to send him to study for the ministry at Harvard. So he goes to the print shop, and he gets to read all the books that come in from England that they're reprinting, and he gets to borrow the books from all of the booksellers. And then he wants to write for his brother's paper, but his brother is very jealous. So he makes up a pen name, Silence Dogood.
Right.
And here's a 16-year-old kid by this point. This is when he became a writer. He'd never slept out of Boston his entire life, unmarried, and he's pretending to be an older, widowed woman living in the countryside.
Some 16-year-old kid.
And, of course, one of his great Silence Dogood essays, I mean, he slips them under the door of his brother's print shop, and they get printed in the New England Courant.
And everybody talks about it.
Everybody talks about it. And one of the first is a great attack on Harvard, so he got back at Harvard eventually.
At 17, he leaves.
He runs away. He runs
First to New York.
First to New York, because he wants to get a job in a print shop in New York. but there's no work to be had. And so the printer in New York decides to send him on to Philadelphia, where his son had a print shop. Franklin was running away from his brother because he had been apprenticed to his brother, and he wasn't going to just stay apprentice. So he ran away and broke the apprenticeship agreements.
There's so much to talk about, just family relationships. What comes through this book is that he has never been, he was cold, tough on family, tough on his son,
family,
tough on his brother.
Well, he called that an errata, what he did to his brother, and they made up. And when his brother was dying, Benjamin Franklin adopted his brother's son, helped educate him, got him set up in the print business. With his wife, Deborah, or his common-law wife, because they never officially got married, he had a very sort of practical relationship. She hated to travel. She never left Market Street in Philadelphia, spent every night there her entire life.
But she wanted him to return from London, didn't she?
Right. And he, of course, loves to travel and spends 15 of the last 17 years of their marriage away. So, but they got along well. It was just not a deeply romantic thing.
Back to New York. He's got to get to Philadelphia. He walks up Market Street.
Right, spending his coins to get 3 puffy rolls. And, of course, he's writing the scene.
Is that true or not true?
Oh, it's definitely true, the scene of him walking up Market Street, using his money to buy the puffy rolls. But he's using it to make a point, because he's writing that tale about 50 years later.
From his own autobiography.
For his own autobiography. And the autobiography is partly directed at his son. You talk about his family relationships. What a soap opera we have with the son. Because the son is an illegitimate child, not of Deborah Franklin, but an illegitimate child of Benjamin Franklin. The mother's unknown to history, but he's raised by Benjamin Franklin. And they become very, very close. But William Franklin, the son, decides to start putting on airs and becomes a little bit too sophisticated, very royalist, very aristocratic. And so the autobiography is written, at least the first part of it, to say, hey, remember where you came from. Remember your roots. We are middle class, and we're creating a new nation based on middle class values. Don't get to be so pretentious. Remember that you're a leather apron shopkeeper, that your father was a runaway, and that you shouldn't be hanging around with the aristocracy.
Of the founding brothers, founding fathers, he was the most democratic, small d.
Absolutely. He was the one who was a real shopkeeper, real middle class. He was the one who had a real feel for democracy throughout his entire life. And that's what the autobiography is about. It's a self-help book for young entrepreneurs. That's what Poor Richard's Almanac is about. And that's what he fought for when the Declaration and the Constitution was the most democratic possible nation you could have. And we have to remember that a whole lot of our founding fathers and founding brothers, they were not all that democratic. They were elitists. Franklin's the one who was not an elitist.
Someone said, may have been Joe Ellis, said that if, in fact, you'd given an IQ test, Alexander Hamilton would have scored the highest, but Franklin would have been judged the wisest.
Franklin was very sage. He also had a wonderful way of putting on a style that seemed sage, because he used silence very well. He said, whenever you don't know something, just never speak. Use silence, and it makes you seem wise. It makes you seem sage. So that helped a bit. And he said, same with humility. He was listing his virtues, and he listed 12 virtues that he had to acquire. And he was teaching tradesmen how to do this, but he was doing it himself. And he showed it to a Quaker friend, and the Quaker friend said, you're missing one. And he said, what? He said, humility. You're missing humility. And so Franklin says, I tried very hard, but as hard as I tried, I never acquired the virtue of humility, but I was able to acquire the pretense of it, and that was almost as good. I could pretend to be humble, and that served my purposes. Getting back, though, let me get back to the son, William, because we've got, William broke with Franklin during the Revolution, despite what I was saying about the autobiography, and he becomes loyal to the crown. And William has his own illegitimate son named Temple Franklin. And there's a wonderful soap opera where Benjamin Franklin tries to acquire the loyalty of this beautiful grandson, Temple Franklin, and does. And so it's Benjamin Franklin and the grandson Temple against William Franklin during the Revolution.
He was of what mind about the Revolution?
For a very long time, he referred to the British Empire as a fine and noble china vase. He wanted to save it. He believed it could be saved. And Franklin was somebody who believed in moderation and compromise. He thought he could negotiate a settlement between Britain and America. But by late 1774, he's fed up. He's given up, and he comes back to Philadelphia in 1775, declares that he's a rebel, declares that he's for the revolution, and became one of the earnest patriots.
Always there is about him ambition, right?
Yeah, he's a very ambitious man, but he was proud of it. He said that's what's going to make America great, that middle-class ambition to rise in this world. And he said, you know, his father always quoted Solomon's wisdom about be diligent in thy calling, and thou shalt stand before kings. And he said, to me, that was my ambition, to be diligent in my calling, which was mainly to be a printer and a publisher. And he said, it so happened I stood before 5 kings and even got to sit down with one. The king of Denmark invited me to dinner.
He said something once about power and avarice, about ambition, and that men, using men as representative of all people, I guess, that they were driven by 2 things. One, the need for power and the need for money.
Right.
He wanted money.
Not really. You know, he retires in his mid-40s and doesn't take a salary for working in government. And when he made that argument...
But he made some money, hadn't he?
He made a lot of money.
Okay.
He had franchised his print shops all over the colonies. And he was the first, you know, to understand this notion of a media conglomerate. So he's got print shops all the way from Boston and Providence down to the Bahamas and Bermuda. And he's making money from each of these, so he becomes quite wealthy. But then he said, I would rather have it said of me that I lived usefully than that I died wealthy. That's in a letter to his mother. So he retires. He forms...
He's how old? 42?
He's about 42, exactly.
42.
Exactly halfway through his life. He lived to be 84. And so he retires, and he's arguing that people should not take a salary for serving in government. And that's because he said avarice and money, you know, this ambition are the 2 things that drive people, and you don't want that to happen. So he was trying to conquer this in himself, conquer his ambition, and he certainly was able to conquer his any greed, because he was not a greedy person, and he did not strive to get great wealth.
What did the others think of him? Jefferson, Washington,
Jefferson loved him.
Hamilton.
Yeah. Jefferson comes and replaces him in France after Franklin has been an ambassador, and somebody says, you know, you're here to succeed Franklin. He says, nobody can succeed him. I just hope to follow him or something. I can't replace him. They were both avatars of the Enlightenment. And the person that they both hated, and who hated both them, is the 3rd person in France with them most of the time, John Adams. Because John Adams is, it's a love-hate relationship with Franklin, but John Adams is very puritanical. He's very prudish. He's a little bit stuck up. And Franklin has at least 2 girlfriends in Paris and is truly enjoying himself. And John Adams found that all a little unbearable. But he also found Jefferson unbearable as well.
Why? Oh, Adams did.
Adams
did.
Well,
they
Adams.
split.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But there is a great time. I mean, there's some wonderful anecdotes with Adams and Franklin, because even though they were personally so different, and Franklin was seductive and charming, and Adams was very blunt and cold and coarse.
And industrious.
They once had to travel together right in 1776, right after the Declaration. The Revolution is on, and Lord Howe has landed in New York with a peace proposal from the British. And he sends it to Franklin, with whom he had negotiated over a game of chess, a peace proposal a couple years earlier that didn't work. And Adams is a little suspicious. So Franklin and Adams travel together to Staten Island to meet Lord Howe to see if they can accept this peace treaty on behalf of the Continental Congress. And there's only one room at the end, so they have to sleep together in a small bed, which is a very hard scene to imagine of Franklin and Adams together. And Franklin had a theory that you caught cold not from cold weather, but from lack of ventilation. In fact, he was right. He was the first person to really come up with the notion of the contagious theory of colds, that it was spread by germs. So he keeps opening the window in this small room, and it's very, very cold, and Adams keeps wanting it shut. And they lie there in bed, and Adams in his diary writes about how Franklin went on about the contagious theory of colds he had until Adams finally fell asleep.
And what's amazing is, think about this, he's born in 1706.
Right.
So in 1776, he's 70 years old.
Right, and by the time he's, you know, helping write the Constitution, he's 80.
He had a hand in 4 great documents.
The 4 great documents that founded America, he's the only one to be involved in them all. He edited the Declaration of Independence in a beautiful fashion with Jefferson. He helped write the Constitution and signed it. He negotiated the peace treaty with England that ended the war and signed it, and he had negotiated the alliance with France that got France in on our side of the war. Also, he had written the first plan of union, the first sort of thing that brought the colonies together in a united way, which was the Albany Plan of Union in 1754.
Without Franklin in Paris,
Yeah.
the Americans would never have won the Revolution.
You know, that's probably right. That sounds like it's overstating it. But without French help, we would not have won the Revolution. It was the French who helped, win the Battle of Yorktown. They had more troops there than we did. They were the ones with the Navy that, blocked the escape. I think 90% of all the gunpowder used by American troops during the Revolution was supplied by France. And Franklin was the one who was in charge of procuring all those supplies, including through all sorts of profiteers and cutouts. And France, even though it had a 400-year history of having wars with England, was at peace with England then, and did not want to come in on the American side during the Revolution. But Franklin was able to persuade the king, both in terms of the realism and in terms of idealism, to come in.
And what's interesting about it, this is when a revolution against another king. And so one monarch has to go for a revolution.
Well,
come to terms with the fact I'm supporting revolution.
Yeah. Louis XVI wasn't exactly thrilled about the notion of throwing off hereditary monarchs, but I think he was less favorably disposed to Britain, so he ended up coming in.
And what role did Adams play in prodding Franklin about the French?
Well, Adams was always in favor of being tougher with the French, and he wanted to stand up to the French. In fact, he was somewhat anti-French and felt we should take a hard line with them. Franklin was just the opposite. He felt it was easier to seduce the French than to push the French. I think we could use Franklin today to help us a bit with our relationships with France.
I want to get to today, looking back with Franklin in a few minutes, and we'll talk about that, how Franklin, what he stood for, what his values were, how applicable they are to today. Clearly, you believe that he was a master diplomat in terms of both articulating America's strength as well as its values, as well as its virtues, so that he could make the argument to use both in combination.
You know, he arrives in Paris. This is in end of 1776, right after he's helped edit the Declaration. He's the most famous American in the world, by far. He may be one of the most famous people in the world.
Is that because of science?
That's because of the lightning rod.
Right, okay.
The lightning rod, at the beginning of that century, whenever a thunderstorm happened, they'd ring the church bells to try to ward off the lightning. And in 1 year alone, I think there were about 320 bell ringers killed and exploded throughout all of Europe. And as Franklin pointed out in a letter to one of his correspondents, he said, you'd think they'd try something different at some point. So he's the one, he's called by Immanuel Kant the new Prometheus, because he snatched lightning from the skies. So he is enormously famous, so famous that when he arrives in Paris, people pay money to get seats on the street when they're going to carry him by in his chair as he enters Paris to go to the Royal Academy there.
Now, what did he prove?
In terms of electricity?
Yeah.
There's many things. First of all, he proved that electricity was a current, as opposed to two types of electricity. You had the single current theory of electricity. He invented various names, like positive and negative, to show the flow of electricity. He invented the idea of a battery and the name battery, and condenser, and plus and minus. So his main theory was the notion that electricity was a flow, and, of electrons or whatever. And then he also proved that lightning was just a form of electricity, a form of a spark. And he was able to show that with his famous experiment that was carried out first in France, which was a huge lightning rod on a platform. And they collected the electricity from the clouds and were able to store it in a battery that Franklin had designed.
How did Poor Richard's Almanac come about?
In the very first Poor Richard's Almanac, 1733, it's great because he gets to write under the pseudonym of Richard Saunders. And he said, I would like to say that this almanac
Which
came...
means he's then 27. He's then
27 years old. Very good, yeah. You're good at math. But he said, I would like to pretend that this almanac came about because I wanted to edify the population and teach them wonderful moral maxims. But if truth be told, my wife is annoyed that I have all of these rattling traps and scientific experiments, and I never make any use of them. And she says if I don't start making money, she's going to throw me out of the house. So here I am to try to make some money and do this almanac. It became the best-selling almanac in the colonies. It outsold the Bible because people had to buy it every year. It was selling about 25,000, 30,000 copies a year, which is huge.
And this made him rich, too?
Oh, yeah, that was the first thing that made him rich, and then he was able to franchise his print shops because of it.
He never got any money from a patent on the Franklin stove.
Never got any money from any patent. Although he believed in patents, he was offered a patent on the Franklin stove, on the lightning rod, on the bifocals, on many things he invented, the odometer, and he always said, we stand on the backs of others. At this point, he had made his money as a printer. He becomes a scientist and an inventor after he's been a printer, and he really doesn't want to exploit it to become wealthy. So he says, I'm going to give it to the public, I'm going to publish it all. He publishes it in Poor Richard's Almanac, How to Do a Lightning Rod, and when the governor offers him a patent, he says, no, you stand on the back of others when you do science. I don't feel I should try to own it.
When he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, what was it he said about a republic? What was it?
Well, first of all, at the very end of the convention, he gives this beautiful speech saying, you may not think this is the best possible Constitution, but you ought to vote for it unanimously, was his point. And he said, and the longer I live, the more I realize I may be fallible. And therefore, even though I may not disagree with every point in this Constitution, I'm going to vote for it, and we should all vote for it unanimously. And so they line up by state to sign it. And he says, he looks at George Washington's chair, and he said, you know, artists always have trouble distinguishing between a rising sun and a setting sun. And I've looked at the sun on the back of General Washington's chair and always wondered what it was. But now I know it's a rising sun. And they go outside. A few of them walk outside afterwards, and it's been very secretive. They've done all this in secret. It's very hot, but they kept the windows closed. And Mrs. Pownall, a great lady of Philadelphia, walks up and says, what have you done? What have you achieved? What have you wrought? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it.
Wow. Now, I want to just pull back now for a second. And so you, 11 years ago, because of the Kissinger thinking about diplomacy, decide you want to write a biography of Benjamin Franklin. Where do you start?
Well, first of all, I decided I wanted to try to explain where American values come from, especially those middle-class values. Now, when I decided to do Franklin, there's 47 volumes of his papers, about 37 of which are published by Yale, and they're publishing new ones each year. And so it's easy to read all of his papers, and it's fun to read them because it's totally fascinating. He is the most readable person because he writes like a journalist, not like a preacher.
Now, who gave the money to put all the Franklin's papers?
Henry Luce.
That's what I
Henry
thought.
Luce, our founder of Time magazine. So there's a little connection there. And I went up to Yale. But they also have them now on a CD-ROM, which isn't available to the public, but I kind of tried to cajole and begged and finally got a copy of the CD-ROM that the Packard Humanities Institute is doing. So I'd had all of his papers on my laptop, and you can search them by phrase and correspondent and stuff. So I just spent years and years just reading his papers whenever I had a spare chance. It was so much, I mean, it was
So you'd
fun.
be sitting up at night reading his papers?
Yeah.
Off the CD-ROM?
Yeah, I was sitting there reading them on the computer or in some of the books or at an airport anywhere.
So this was 11 years ago, and then you dive into this. So that's a primary source.
Yes, and there's been some really good books on Franklin, of course, written. Some books on his science. I. Bernard Cohen wrote a great book on his science. Ed Morgan, as you know, just did a book last year analyzing his papers. H.W. Brands. Carl Van Doren wrote a beautiful book in 1938, a literary biography of Franklin.
And how good is his autobiography?
Franklin's autobiography is great. It ends right when he goes to England to become an agent for the colonies.
In
so
1754 or 1752?
Yeah, it ends at about 1760, actually.
Right.
So it doesn't go all the way through his life. And it's written, as I say, as a PR document, partly to persuade his son not to become an aristocrat, and partly to sort of inculcate these virtues, these middle-class shopkeeping virtues in a rising America.
That's the reason that some people don't like him.
Right.
They think he's what?
Striving, ambitious, that he doesn't have a sense of tragedy, of poetry, of moral gravity, that he's somebody who leads
earnestness.
He leads an ethical life, but not perhaps this exalted, tragic feeling of existence, because he's basically middle class. And a lot of the, over the years, opposition to him, I think, is snobbery against middle class values and bourgeois values. I mean, he was you had bashers of the bourgeoisie from the far left and the far right, from elitist intellectuals to, you know, aspiring Marxists and communists. And so people look upon Ben Franklin as just propounding these middle-class values. I think that's a shallow reading of him. I think that he really does believe in the middle-class values, but he also believes that that's a foundation for democracy, and that democracy is the most moral way of approaching things because it demands a respect for each and every individual. And that's why he was very anti-elitist. But you know, you have elitists in every age who look down upon Franklin's middle-class values.
But I assume with Hamilton, did he and Hamilton get along?
Yes, a bit, but Hamilton was much younger.
Right.
Hamilton was very much of a gossip, and so he always was writing his friends in Philadelphia, fascinated about Benjamin Franklin. And in 1775, when Franklin comes back from England, Hamilton's wondering, is he going to become pro-revolution or is he going to stay loyalist?
Because there were some questions about his ambition to be what?
A royal governor?
A royal governor of Pennsylvania.
Yes, he wanted to be. He wanted to get a royal appointment sometime during the 1760s, to some extent. But you know, as with all people, it was kind of mixed. He was of mixed minds. He wouldn't have minded a royal appointment, but he did fend it off a bit.
But he would have accepted. I mean, we're probably happy that he did not fashion a compromise he might have been able to fashion with his diplomatic skills. Are we
right.
Not?
Well, I guess if you don't
we want
like
the
being
revolution
British,
to go full steam, right?
Yeah, right. If you
if you don't want to be British, yeah,
if you
well,
don't
exactly.
want to be British,
if you want to be, yeah.
No, I think, and I think he realized that by 1775, he realized all that stuff he had done in the previous 10 years to try to fashion a compromise didn't make much sense.
And we ought to be glad
It was better to have
that.
an American empire. So he comes back in 1775. Hamilton,
or an American experiment.
Right. And Hamilton is writing all of his friends saying, which way is Dr. Franklin going to go? And Franklin, right in July of 1775, a year before the Declaration, he declares his own independence and tells his son, who's still the royal governor of New Jersey, and writes a public letter to one of his friends saying, "You're now my enemy." And he declares fervently in favor of the revolution, and thus becomes very close to Jefferson as they write the Declaration of Independence.
So what's relevant about Benjamin Franklin today?
You know, in 1776, in July, this very week, when they're writing the Declaration, I'm going to tell a little tale and try to bring it to relevance here. Jefferson writes the first draft. It's a messy draft. You can go see it in the Library of Congress. It's a wonderful document.
It's a messy draft, though.
It's a messy draft of the Declaration. It's the first draft, and it's got all sorts of cross-outs and stuff. It's, you know, it's like those of us who write longhand at first, and it's a big mess. And Jefferson writes the sentence, Jefferson writes the sentence on a little lap desk on Market Street, right next door to Franklin's house. He writes, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And then he sends it 2 doors away to Franklin, says, "Would you be so kind as to peruse the document and in your great wisdom," people were very nice to editors back then, "in your great wisdom, edit it for me." So Franklin takes his heavy pen of a printer and does those backslashes that printers do to cross things out. And he crosses out, he crosses out "sacred and undeniable" and changes it to "we hold these truths to be self-evident."
Right.
And he says to Jefferson, the point he makes is, we're creating a nation in which the democracy comes from reason, not from religion. We're separating ourselves from religion in terms of church and state. We're all very religious, but the fact that we have our rights comes both from our Creator, but also from reason. And he is trying to create an enlightened nation that believes in religious tolerance. Now, if you look at the struggle of the last century, it was against tyranny. It was against communism and fascism. If you look at the struggle of this century, today, right now, it's against intolerance and mainly religious intolerance. That's what this century is going to be about. And that's why Franklin's values, the notion that religious tolerance and tolerance between tribes, people, different religions, different races, whatever, is the most important value to have in a democracy. And when he died, he had donated to the building fund of each and every church in Philadelphia. And right before he died, to the new synagogue there, the Mikvah Israel Synagogue. And carrying him to his grave, instead of the minister of his church, were all the ministers of every church and the rabbi of Philadelphia and the people, because he had built a hall that said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send people to preach Muhammad to us, we would have a hall here for them. So all the itinerant preachers marching him to the grave because he wanted to create a society based on pluralism and religious tolerance.
So that's part of what his lesson is for today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most important lesson we have for today, both in terms of America's role in the world and our role as a society is to fight off any forms of religious intolerance, racial intolerance, and to try to understand that our democracy is based on pluralism and respect and tolerance for other people's beliefs.
What else?
That's it. That's what he came at as a printer. What else?
Yeah.
It comes from being a journalist and a printer. He wrote a wonderful editorial the first couple of years that he had his paper called Apology for Publishers, in which he said, you know, because somebody had disagreed and wanted to sue him, he said, you may not agree with everything written in this paper, but if printers only printed things that everybody agreed with, there'd be very little printed.
Yes.
And what makes a democracy, and what, he didn't say democracy, what makes a society great is tolerance for different people's views. And when the truth and falsity each have fair play, truth is going to win out at the end. And so that notion of tolerating different beliefs, tolerating different religions, it's something we occasionally lose in our society today. But after 9/11 and after what's happened in this world, we can realize the value again of tolerance.
He also believed in discussion. I mean, what was the name of that? Junto
The
Society?
Junto, yeah.
Society, which he created very young in
Very
Philadelphia.
young. I mean, there's
it was like laborers,
yeah,
a whole group
22
of guys.
years old, and it was a leather apron club, he called it, for people who were shopkeepers. It's like the Aspen Institute, in a way, which was just for enlightened discussion of important scientific and social ideas, political ideas. But he had a wonderful Socratic method. He said, you know, you should never directly contradict anybody in the junto. You should ask questions, you should make suggestions, but all discourse is to be civil. He really believed in the notion of not getting into big fights, or he would hate the crossfire culture we have today.
Did he once say something like that all, war is bad, peace is always good, or something? What was that
He
great
said
quote?
there's no such thing as a good war or a bad
peace.
peace. I'm not sure he actually believed that. He said it about 5 times. The good thing about having all of his writings on a CD-ROM is you can search for how many times he wrote it.
What did he mean? That war was somehow...
It was right during the Revolution. The problem is he raised the first private militia in Philadelphia. He also raised funds for the protection of Pennsylvania against the French and the Indians. He was in favor of the Revolution. He went there with George Washington and raised money for them. So he was not a pacifist. I think he liked that turn of phrase, but it didn't represent his core philosophy.
What myths did you find out about his life as you looked at it?
Well, you know, we always think of him as this doddering old sage flying a kite in the rain and spouting these maxims of a penny saved is a penny earned and early to bed, early to rise. Certainly he was not an early to bed or early to rise
Especially
guy.
not in France.
Especially not in France. He liked going to bed very late. Yeah. In fact, he helped invent daylight savings time. He stayed up all night once playing chess in France with one of his mistresses or girlfriends and a couple other people. And at 7 in the morning, he opened the window and said, "Oh, my goodness, I didn't know it was light then." He said, if we just shift the clock a bit, we could save a lot on candles. So it was sort of thought of as a precursor of daylight savings. I think one of the myths is that he doesn't have is that it's these shallow moral maxims that are in Poor Richard. People confuse that with the real Benjamin Franklin. The real Benjamin Franklin had a really strong sense of morality and basic human values. And he created this character, Poor Richard, and he created the character called Benjamin Franklin in the autobiography. That's somewhat simplistic, but his life is much more complicated.
What are the flaws?
Well, he was not a great family person. He had this horrible falling out with his son that I explained.
Right.
He was away from his wife most of the time, and he replicated his family in various places. When he lived in London, he had a sort of a domestic partner. I'm not sure that they were romantically connected, but Mrs. Stevenson and her daughter, and so he sort of had a nice domestic household there, and another when he goes to France. So, you know, he had sort of an odd family life, but he was deeply committed to both his ideals, and he was close to his wife, even though they lived apart a lot of the time. They had a great understanding and partnership.
What regrets did he have about what he had done and didn't do?
You know, one problem with him that people sometimes point to is there's a sense of complacency. complacency, in the sense
But
that
a man who's done so much, there was complacency?
Well, I guess he was sanguine or something. He didn't have a whole lot of regrets. And when he was near the end of his life, he wrote to his sister, and he said, you know, people ask what regrets do I have, and, you know, there are many little errors I made, but no, he said, and if I could live my life over again, I would love to do it with just correcting a few errors along the way, as if I were a printer correcting a new edition of a work.
He thought that probably because he had come so far. I mean, he had done everything that, I mean, this was a young man in Boston. His father was an immigrant. And he had played a role in the founding of a country. He achieved great wealth. He knew everybody in the world. He became famous. He had scientific achievements that everybody would recognize him for. I mean, but he came, and he never forgot where he came from.
He never forgot where he came from.
Respected that origin.
I mean, at age 21, he signs himself B. Franklin Printer. And when he writes his last will and testament at age 82 or 83, it's B. Franklin Printer. He very much wanted to just be a tradesman of Philadelphia. He didn't have the aspirations to be part of an aristocracy or to have great titles and stuff. So he was very satisfied in his life because he had been enormously successful. And, you know, he had a simple creed, a simple religious creed. Because he was religious, even though he believed in religious tolerance and, you know, was not a member of any specific doctrine, but he was very religious. And he said, I truly believe that the best way to serve God is to help one's fellow man, because that's what God would have us do. And he, more and more towards the end of his life, he just dedicates himself to doing that. And he had one regret as he got near the end of his life, one blemish on his character in his own mind in terms of the politics and the fight against tyranny. And that is that he hadn't opposed slavery strong enough, and he had even owned a couple of slaves.
So how he felt what about that?
You know, we have to wrestle when we write about the founders with slavery, and they had to wrestle with it. And Franklin really wrestled with it. It was the one time he realized he had let himself down morally. And so near the end of his life, he becomes the president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery, and dedicates his final years to fighting strongly against slavery.
Well, what did his friend Jefferson say about that?
You know, he broke with Jefferson some on slavery and others, although it's, you know, I don't want to try to speak for Jefferson. It's very complex. But slavery is the great blemish on the character of the founders. It is, if you believe in the fight against tyranny, and you didn't see it in terms of slavery. And he had, even as a younger man, he had written and published some anti-slavery tracts, but he had allowed advertising for slavery in his paper, and he had had a household slave or two off and on for part of his life. So not only does he free his slaves, of course, he insists in his will that all of his family members free all their slaves. And the very last thing he writes, his first piece of writing ever, was a hoax, Silence Do Good, pretending to be Silence Do Good, age 16. His very last piece is a hoax. It's a parody. And a congressman had attacked Franklin for being fervently against slavery and given this long speech on the floor of Congress about defending slavery. And so Franklin writes this parody of a speech that was found 100 years ago in Algiers, given by somebody who was defending the enslavement of white Christians from Europe to work in Algeria. And, of course, the speech in the Divan of Algiers, as it was called, is an exact replica of the Georgia congressman's speech, but sort of a flip side of it. And so it's Franklin using his pen and fighting very strong to overcome this blemish on his fight against tyranny.
When you delve into a founding father, on the positive side, how do you explain this greatness? What was it that made what they accomplished so remarkable? When you see the letters, you see how they corresponded with each other, and you understood the environment they lived in, the passions they had, the differences among them. How do you come to grips with this remarkable group of people? Well,
they invented something new out of whole cloth, this notion of a democratic republic. And it wasn't obvious that that's where we were going to come out. And when they go into the Constitutional Convention, they're all very strong-willed, and they're fighting over everything, whether it be a direct democracy, whether they be by states, that sort of thing. And a lot of them were heroes, people who stood on principle, and it almost broke down. And Franklin was a tradesman, and he said, when I was a carpenter and we had to make a joint of a table, and the pieces of wood didn't fit, you'd shave from one side and you'd shave from the other until you made a perfect joint and it fit. And this is what we have to do here. We each have to give up some of our demands and compromise a bit. And so he proposes the compromise in which you have a Senate in which the states are represented by 2 votes per state, and a House in which the people are represented by proportional representation. And he says, we have to do this grand compromise, or we're going to fail. And they passed the grand compromise because of him. And I think that what made him great is that compromisers don't make great heroes, but compromisers do make great democracies. And he helped them learn that respect for other people's opinion meant that you don't try to be a hero, you have to compromise sometime in order to make the democracy. And in the end, all of the founders, for all of their greatness, especially with Franklin there guiding them, agree to compromise and create the Constitution, which turns out to be a pretty darn good document.
They all viewed him as a kind of elder statesman.
Yeah, he was twice as old exactly as the average age of everybody else at the Constitutional Convention. He was about 25 years older than anybody.
They were all about 30. And
they were all in their 30s or 40s, and he was 80 or so.
Yeah,
and
he died when he was 84.
Yeah, he was 84 during that year, yes.
Yeah. And we know what Jefferson thought his most remarkable accomplishments were because he put them on his tombstone. It was the creation of the University of Virginia, writing Virginia religious liberties. It was not being president. What would Franklin list as the most important things?
Well, first of all, he would list the founding of the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the things he did. And there's an interesting...
It wasn't called the University of Pennsylvania then. What was it called?
It was called the Philadelphia Academy,
right.
but it becomes the University of Pennsylvania in the 1790s. And there's an interesting thing if you put it side by side with Jefferson's University of Virginia, which was founded around then too. Jefferson was sort of an elitist, and his idea of a meritocracy, as expressed in the founding charter of the University of Virginia, is to skim off the most talented people and make a new aristocracy, he called them, by skimming them off and raising them up through the University of Virginia. And Franklin is just the opposite. Give everybody a chance. All aspiring tradesmen, all people who are diligent and aspiring can be made smarter and do better, and they should all be educated. And he wasn't trying to create a new elite. He was just trying to make the average tradesman smarter.
So more than anyone, he was the original American.
He is definitely the person who defines what our meritocracy and what our democracy became.
But that is in essence what America is it not?
Yeah. You know, there are 2 strands in America.
And the aversion to tyranny, and respect for the common person.
That's what our democracy is about.
And the belief in meritocracy.
And, belief in a free press and a good sense of humor. I mean, that Cracker Barrel humor that he had, sort of the Mark Twain, Will Rogers type of humor with Silence Dogood and Polly Baker and all the characters he created, a sort of that down-home wisdom of
You said this in one interview. If he was here today, living in the United States in 2003, he'd do well because he would be of and about the information revolution.
He would love it. He'd be the type of person that after the show tonight, we'd go out, have a beer, and you'd show him your BlackBerry or your Palm Pilot and how it works.
And you want to know
a business plan, and we'd talk about Bush's foreign policy or maybe Clinton's scandals or something. He'd be the person that real flesh and blood guy you could relate to.
The interesting thing, Jefferson died essentially broke. Franklin died rich.
Franklin died quite rich, but he takes his money, most of it, and he puts it into an account for the aspiring tradesmen of Philadelphia and Boston. And he sets up a fund, and being very meticulous, he even calculates the interest it will grow. And the fund is supposed to last 200 years and give scholarships to the aspiring tradesmen of the city. And it worked almost exactly the way he said. And even recently, I think it was last year, I looked up the winners of it, and in West Philadelphia from a inner city, poor high school, some kids won the Tour de Sol race, where you invent experimental cars. They invented a solar car that won the race. And I thought the father of electricity would truly be pleased that the bequest he gave upon his death is still paying off that
and
way.
here's the great irony, too, is that how much he respected science. Your own magazine, at the end of the millennium, which you were the editor of, said science and Einstein was the most significant influence of the century, right?
And I think that Franklin's...
Franklin became a man of science.
Yeah. Franklin very much was a man of science, and what's interesting to me is how the science sort of spilled over to his politics and to his diplomacy, because he was the first of the American pragmatists. He said, let's be experimental, let's test out these things, let's not be ideological, and he was always very good at sort of using the methods of science, experiment, testing, looking at the evidence, whenever he applied it to diplomacy or to politics.
This Amazing Adventures of Benjamin Franklin, this comes out on July 4th, July 7th, but it covers July 4th. How are we going to celebrate this tricentennial of Benjamin Franklin?
There's some great people pulling together the 300th anniversary of Benjamin Franklin.
You're going to be on every panel in America.
I'll enjoy being on wherever they invite me. I love Franklin. There's a woman named Conover Hunt who's helping to run a consortium of groups that includes the University of Pennsylvania, the Franklin Institute, the American Philosophical Society, which he founded, and many other organizations. And I hope we find wonderful ways to celebrate everything about Franklin, his science, his diplomacy, his belief in the common person, his understanding of democracy. There's so much about him to celebrate. What
were his 7 virtues that you... Oh, well, here they are.
Yeah,
here they are. These are the 7 virtues that are here. An aversion to tyranny, we've talked about that. A free press, we talked about that. Truth shall set you free. Humor, creating silence do good.
And Poor Richard.
And Poor Richard, yeah. 6 was compromise. We talked about that. And 7 was tolerance. Religion. Was he a religious man?
As I say, his creed was that God would have him do what's best for his fellow man. Right. He went to the church in Philadelphia, the Reverend Jedediah Andrews of the Presbyterian Church, and he said all the preacher ever talked about was was the dogma, but he never talked about doing good for fellow people. So Franklin thought it would be more useful to spend my Sundays reading and writing and doing experiments. So he didn't go to church that often, but he was very religious, and throughout his life, he became more and more of a believer in God.
There has been some revisionism about the kite story.
Yeah.
What is that about?
Well,
this is by Frederick Golden. Yeah. When sparks flew, Franklin and his son were the only witnesses to his legendary kite experiment. What really happened?
Well, I think he flew the kite.
Right.
You have to remember that the kite experiment, even in his own retelling of it, came after the French had already proved the experiment. The experiment was originally one in which you use a big long rod to take the lightning from the sky. So the French prove it. He becomes absolutely world famous. And almost as an afterthought, he says, well, the French have already proved it, but let me tell you how an ingenious way we actually did it in Philadelphia is we couldn't erect this rod that high, so we used a kite to draw the electricity down, and it worked well the same way. He wouldn't have lied about his experiments, and Bernard Cohen, this great professor of the history of science, and if people want to read about Franklin's science, they should get his books, Benjamin Franklin's Science, gives a whole long history of the kite experiment and the electricity experiments.
Did this experience of writing and learning and reading change you and your attitude and your ideas about America, about the challenge of the future, or did it reinforce emerging ideas within you?
Well, I hope it changed me. I mean, that's the whole point. That's the whole point of biography, and that's the whole point of reading or writing.
It changes you, or it changes...
Well, it changed my way of thinking. I mean, I was exploring Benjamin Franklin the way you explore lives to see how do you lead a more useful life, how do you lead a more meaningful life, a more spiritual life, or a worthier life. And I don't know that I've become necessarily worthier, but I've tried to, because that's the whole point of looking at how somebody led a worthy life.
Okay. You have had an evolutionary life. You have done from New Orleans, Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, London Times, Time Magazine, the information, whatever that thing you did at Time Magazine about What's it called? Pathfinder.
Pathfinder.
And then CNN, you know.
And the Aspen Institute.
And now the Aspen Institute. My question, did looking at Franklin and the way he led his life influence decisions you've made about what you want to do with your life at 50?
Yeah.
I want you to be I want you to be introspective.
I'll be very introspective here. You know, I was at CNN, and I wasn't feeling like it was a perfect fit for the rest of my life. And you do what you're supposed to be doing in life, and I was working hard at it and enjoying it, but not. And I was somewhat emboldened by the notion of Franklin's idea of moving on and how you should, you know, at a certain point, having been a journalist and a media person himself for about 25 years, he moves on and does something different. It emboldened me a little bit to say, okay, now there are other ways that I can try to be involved in public service, be involved in education, be involved in discussion the way he was. You know, that was one thing that affected me some. Also, he had a certain set of values that helped find common ground for people. He was not a very partisan or ideological person. And he said with a lot of common sense and a little bit of experiment, we can always find some common ground on some great issues. And to me, that's an important thing for our society now because we've become a little bit polarized, we've become a little bit partisan, the discourse has gotten a bit too bellicose. And I did not feel comfortable with all the compromises and trims you have to make in being part of a bellicose or partisan age. And so I wanted to read more and write more about Franklin and perhaps do things that in my writing or in the work I did help people find common ground.
Did you seek the Aspen Society, or was it a godsend when it came?
Oh, it was like Franklin's bolt of lightning. I was sitting there at a dinner, their annual dinner, and I was there because Judy Woodruff of CNN was the MC, and Jimmy Carter and John Whitehead were being honored, and we decided to go. And I sat there with some of the trustees, and they started talking to me about this possibility, and it sort of fell on my lap, which was very nice.
Because it gives you, what's the mission you have for the Aspen Society?
I think part of it is
this
common ground idea, and part of it is educational. You know, we spend a lot of our times trimming and compromising and perhaps losing touch with our values. The 1990s was a particular period where both losing touch with values, whether it be Wall Street in American business, not just the WorldCom and the Enrons, but even some of the people in the company I work for and others, you know, lost touch with the underlying values of what we did. Likewise, the politics, whether it be during the Clinton administration or the whole wars that surrounded that, were very detached from values. The whole internet bubble was almost detached from underlying values. And I think there's a reaction to the 90s going on. I think that's why people are reading about Benjamin Franklin and some of the other founders, like John Adams or whatever, to say, well, what are the fundamental values? And, you know, it seemed like a good time for me to move on.
This book is called Benjamin Franklin and American Life by Walter Isaacson. Every review I have read has said this is one of the best about a man. Walter has said himself in interviews prior to this with publishers and people like that, you know, that we ought to revisit Franklin at least every generation, if not every decade. This is your chance to reintroduce yourself to Benjamin Franklin and to see about the founding of America that may very well have some guidance about America in the 21st century. My thanks to Walter Isaacson for this hour. See you tomorrow night. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Franklin, for good and for bad, that sort of strivingly upward mobile, yuppie entrepreneur, a man of the information age back then. And I could relate to that, not that I'll ever be as great as Franklin, I could relate to that, even the downside of that sort of really ambitious personality.
You said he was one of the great networkers of all time.
Yes, right.
I mean, he knew everybody in the Enlightenment.
He's like Europe. Me and you, Charlie.
Yeah, he knew everybody in the Enlightenment in Europe. He was well known in Europe. He spent, 10, 12 years in Britain.
He was the most famous American of his time in Europe, by far.
Scientist, inventor.
We had conquered electricity and done the lightning rod, which made him world famous, because that was the biggest discovery in that century all over the world.
He always thought of himself as what?
A printer, a publisher. He thought of himself as a media person. What happened at age about 12, he decides he wants to be a writer. He's an apprentice to his older brother, who's not very nice to him. Right. And what he does is he takes a Spectator magazine, Addison and Steele's publication from London, and he reads the essays, and he copies the arguments, and then he cuts them up and shuffles them up and scatters them about and goes back to him a day later and tries to recreate the original essay to see if he could do it as well. And sometimes he would even turn it into poetry, so it would make him use different words and then turn it back into the essay, because he wanted to make himself, as he said, a tolerable writer. And that's how he first got into writing.
By then he liked books.
He loved books. He used to, he was so lucky that his dad apprenticed him to a print shop, because his father was going to send him to Harvard, but then decided he was not quite religious enough to go to Harvard to study for the...
He was too much of a free spirit,
Too much of a free spirit, exactly. In fact, at one point his father was putting away all the stores for the winter. They were salting all the pork and the beef. And Franklin says, why don't we just say grace over it just once, and it'll last the entire winter? And that's when his father decided it would be silly to send him to study for the ministry at Harvard. So he goes to the print shop, and he gets to, which Ben Franklin did this great balance of power diplomacy during the Revolution between France, Netherlands, and Spain to get France in on our side. But he was also somebody who pushed America's ideals, and that made France want to come in on our side. And so I couldn't find a whole lot about Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy, so I was studying that. And then the more I studied him, he was like a media mogul. I mean, he had a great printing empire, a newspaper empire. He developed the American Postal Service in order to have a distribution system. And everything about him, he was the last great Renaissance person who did everything. And so I just became obsessed.
And did you also, knowing what your curiosity was, see things that this was a life worth examining because his passions were your passions? Journalism, writing, foreign policy, America's values, on and on.
Yeah, I did share a lot of the things. I spent a lot of time as a journalist, a lot of time as a publisher, and then was very interested in diplomacy. But there was also something about read all the books that come in from England that they're reprinting, and he gets to borrow the books from all of the booksellers. And then he wants to write for his brother's paper, but his brother is very jealous. So he makes up a pen name, Silence Dogood.
Right.
And here's a 16-year-old kid by this point. This is when he became a writer. He'd never slept out of Boston his entire life, unmarried, and he's pretending to be an older, widowed woman living in the countryside.
Some 16-year-old kid.
And, of course, one of his great Silence Dogood essays, I mean, he slips them under the door of his brother's print shop, and they get printed in the New England Courant.
And everybody talks about it.
Everybody talks about it. And one of the first is a great attack on Harvard, so he got back at Harvard eventually.
At 17, he leaves.
He runs away.
First to New York.
First to New York because he wants to get a job in a print shop in New York. But there's no work to be had. And so the printer in New York decides to send him on to Philadelphia, where his son had a print shop. Franklin was running away from his brother because he had been apprenticed to his brother, and he wasn't going to just stay apprentice. So he ran away.
From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Walter Isaacson is here. He is the president and the CEO of the Aspen Institute. He has been chairman of CNN and managing editor of Time magazine. He's also the author of an acclaimed biography on Henry Kissinger. The new biography is Benjamin Franklin, American Life. It will hit bookstores on July 4th. Excerpt from the book are featured in a special issue of Time magazine, which is on the newsstands this week. Look at this cover, The Amazing Adventures of Ben Franklin, plus his 7 Great Virtues by Walter Isaacson. Let me just start at the beginning. What brought you, as busy as you are, with the books that you had written, to Benjamin Franklin?
Well, I was doing the Henry Kissinger biography, and I became fascinated with the notion of idealism in American diplomacy, and that mix of realism